The Elbert Tuttle U.S. Court of Appeals building takes up an entire city block in downtown Atlanta.
The grand second Renaissance-style building is on the National Register of Historic Places.
And this week, judges there heard appeals in two important Georgia voting cases.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. The United States Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit is now open according to law. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Good morning. Please be seated.
One panel is considering whether the conservative group True the Vote illegally intimidated voters when they helped file tens of thousands of voter challenges.
As you all, the panel is already on to, this is an open and shut appeal.
No, it's not.
Another is reviewing Georgia's political maps, the latest turn in the ongoing fight over redistricting.
The idea that this court would say that Judge Jones, who sat with this case for years, got this wrong, I think is really beyond the pale.
Both cases could have national implications.
On today's show, what's at stake for Georgia elections in two long-running federal court cases?
Plus, a messy Republican primary in Georgia for U.S. Senate is now underway.
Christmas came early for political consultants, and it's so true.
I'm WABE politics reporter Rahul Bali.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas, and this is Plugged In from WABE.
So let's begin at the Elbert P. Tuttle U.S. Court of Appeals building in downtown Atlanta, which hosted hearings this week on two important Georgia voting rights cases.
Before we get to the cases, I just want to spend a moment talking a little bit about this court. The building was constructed just after the turn of the century as a courthouse and a post office. And Rahul, when builders broke ground in 1907, they found, a rock formation that looked like an eagle and decided it meant the site was destined to be a federal courthouse. The architect also designed the U.S. Treasury Department in Washington, D.C., and proclaimed this new building as a great step forward in the scheme of beautifying Atlanta. This building has seen some history since then, including arguments in the appeal of the Bush v. Gore case that, as you know, made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court and had a role in determining the outcome of the 2000 election.
You know, Sam, I've been in a lot of government buildings across Atlanta over the years. I've still never been to this one. And one of my favorite questions to ask when we talk about buildings, why is it named that? So who is Elbert Tuttle?
Judge Elbert Tuttle was appointed to what was then the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals by President Dwight Eisenhower, and Tuttle ruled on some pretty important civil rights cases in the 50s and 60s, including a ruling that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. could hold civil rights demonstrations in Albany, that James Meredith could be admitted to the University of Mississippi, and that Julian Bond should be seated in the Georgia House of Representatives after his fellow lawmakers refused to let him take his seat.
In that vein, let's get to the voting rights cases that were argued this week.
So the first case is weighing whether conservative group True the Vote illegally intimidated Georgia voters when they helped file tens of thousands of voter eligibility challenges. Since the 2020 election, the Texas-based group has been a key driver of mass voter challenges in Georgia, citing unproven claims of widespread voter fraud. Most of these claims were dismissed, but the challenges can still confuse voters and bog down election officials, and that led Fair Fight, the group founded by Democrats Stacey Abrams, to file a lawsuit. Now, last year, a lower court judge found True the Vote's tactics reckless, but ruled that the plaintiffs had not sufficiently shown that any Georgia voter was reasonably intimidated under the Voting Rights Act. Now, Fair Fight appealed that ruling, represented in court this week by attorney Uzoma Nkwanta.
This was not a legitimate attempt to adjudicate anyone's qualifications. This was a stunt in order to intimidate voters.
A key question here before this three-judge panel: what constitutes voter intimidation? True the Vote's attorney Jake Evans discussed that with Judge Adalberto Jordan.
I speak only for myself, but I think the district court committed legal error with regard to the attempt.
And Evans pressed the judges to uphold the lower court's decision.
To attempt, there has to be a specific intent to intimidate a voter.
And it really seemed like the judges were inclined to bring this case back to life. And that could have big implications because, remember, these voter challenges have continued and they've been a policy topic for both the state legislature and the state election board. And of course, there's another big election coming up in 2026.
You mentioned there were 2 cases. What was the second, Sam?
Remember redistricting?
No. I try not to think about it. Over the past 4 years, we had 2 legislative special sessions, dozens of court hearings. Hell, we changed the maps in our state capitol office a few times because of redistricting.
Yeah, but this long-running saga is actually not over yet.
Okay, so get us up to speed on this court fight.
The 11th Circuit Court of Appeals heard arguments this week about whether Georgia's congressional and state legislative maps comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Now, this legal fight began in 2021 when Republicans in the state legislature crafted new districts after the last census. Voting and civil rights groups then sued, claiming the maps illegally diluted Black voting power. In 2023, a judge agreed and ordered the maps be redrawn again. Republicans went back to the drawing board, and the judge accepted the new maps ahead of the 2024 election. But the voting and civil rights groups appealed the ruling, saying the new maps failed to remedy the violations. Attorney Abba Khanna argued that point Thursday in front of a 3-judge panel, saying the new maps added majority Black districts outside the areas where they had argued voters had been harmed.
States who have already committed Voting Rights Act violations are notoriously good at finding new and creative ways of perpetuating that Voting Rights Act violation in one way, shape, or form, such that half steps, baby steps, partial remedy, even mostly remedies. Good enough is not good enough.
Attorney Brian Tyson, representing the state, pushed back, saying the lower court and the legislature has wide latitude to draw maps that comply with the Voting Rights Act.
For the plaintiffs to claim that the district court got its own order wrong, you would need something like the district court was looking at a map of West Virginia when it should have been looking at a map of Georgia. I mean, that's the degree of deference we're talking about here.
Now, Rahul, the state is separately pursuing its own appeal of the lower court's original order to redraw the 2021 maps in the first place. Judge Adalberto Jordan says the panel, though, won't rule on these remedial maps until the appeals court weighs in on whether they should have been drawn at all.
Okay, Sam, I want to make a bit of a turn here. We've been talking about redistricting, which is shaped by Georgia's changing population. And one more challenge Georgia's experienced with our population shift is around affordable housing. This week, Democratic U.S. Senator Jon Ossoff gave an update on his investigation into one of the problems around that, out-of-state investors snapping up homes and turning them into rentals.
That's right. A report last year by the Government Accountability Office found that 1 out of every 4 single-family rental homes in Metro Atlanta is owned by an out-of-state investment company. Now, new research from Georgia State University suggests that figure may now be closer to 1 in 3, as firms owned by hedge funds or private equity companies buy up these homes to convert into rentals. Senator Ossoff highlighted the data as part of his ongoing congressional investigation into corporate landlords, and he said the problem is more acute in Georgia than anywhere else in the country.
I think we can all agree that we face a housing crisis, that a young family with a new child who wants to purchase their first home now can't afford it, and that those who are renting face higher and higher rents and more mistreatment from these large out-of-state corporate landlords.
Taylor Shelton, a geography professor at Georgia State, says buyers simply cannot compete with big firms that can make all-cash offers with no contingencies at prices that drive up home values across the whole neighborhood. And Shelton says this puts home ownership out of reach for many Georgians who then end up renting from the very same firms that often conceal who even owns them by using a variety of unique subsidiary names.
It shouldn't require a PhD to know who your landlord is and how many other properties they might own in your city or neighborhood. But even further, I believe Georgians deserve the opportunity to compete on a level playing field in the housing market, which these companies have massively distorted.
Shelton says caps on the number of properties that can be owned by one company would be one step toward addressing this issue.
And this has also been a debate at the state capitol. You may remember 2 years ago a bill by Democratic State Representative Spencer Fry to take away a state tax break for companies that own these homes. Now, that bill did not go anywhere, but Fry told me that he believes the federal tax code may be a place where reforms can happen. So let's take a break here. This is Plugged In from WABE.
Welcome back to Plugged In from WABE.
All right, Sam, hate to say it, but really feels like the 2026 GOP Senate primary, we're starting to really kind of pick up speed on this thing.
I think that is right. Governor Brian Kemp would have had a glide path to the nomination, but he passed on a run, and that has opened the floodgates here. Last week, Georgia GOP strategist Jay Morgan described to me the messy primary fight ahead this way.
Christmas came early for political consultants, and it's so true.
Okay, so let's start with who's not going to be in the race, and that's Georgia Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. She wrote a long social media post last Friday night titled, "My Thoughts on the 2026 Senate Race." Greene says she would win the Republican primary and general election against Jon Ossoff, but says the U.S. Senate just doesn't work, specifically pointing out the need for 60 votes to pass most things in the U.S. Senate. She also pushed back on polling that showed her trailing Ossoff. So, Sam, what do you make of Greene's decision?
Well, I think this is not what Democrats were hoping for. You know, Ossoff's backers had been doing digital fundraising for months now, saying things along the lines of, help Ossoff stop Marjorie Taylor Greene from going to the Senate. And when asked about a run last week on News Nation, Greene said she could win a primary. And I think that is true. But when it comes to the general election, I think that was giving some top Republicans heartburn. You know, people who saw the 2022 Senate race as winnable, if not for Herschel Walker, who was a very controversial candidate. You're hearing people saying you need someone who can run the Kemp playbook to win. And we'd been told that the National Republican Senatorial Committee had not ruled out getting involved in this race to, you know, kind of steer the primary. And neither has Kemp, who has pledged to stay on the political field, even though he won't be on the ballot himself.
So let me talk a little bit more about that, specifically this idea of Kemp working in tandem with President Donald Trump. That could really close the door or even open the door for a GOP candidate. For example, Congressman Mike Collins, who wants to chat with Trump before making a decision. But we should also note, Greene did not rule out a run for governor, which Democratic strategists seem gleeful about this week. Speaking of the governor's race, where Attorney General Chris Carr is already running, I did talk to Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones about getting in. We spoke after Governor Kemp signed the 2026 state budget at the state capitol.
Yeah, a lot of the chatter in the political world is about, you know, what's up next. Obviously, you know, it's probably the worst kept secret, you know, but I'm moving forward on doing what I've talked about and, you know, building a team around me.
Very clearly there, he's not rushed on a timeline, so don't expect an immediate announcement from Burt Jones on a run for governor.
All right, back to the Senate race now. Let's talk about the major figures who are running so far.
So the first politician to declare was Congressman Buddy Carter. He's a longtime figure in Georgia politics going back to the 90s. He was the mayor of Pooler, which is near Savannah. He was first elected to the General Assembly in 2004, made the jump up to Congress in 2014. He's a pharmacist, which is what he's been kind of known for, legislation on prescription drugs, for example, the roles of pharmacy benefit managers. He's also been known for issues around the Savannah port. Another person to jump into the fray, Georgia Insurance Commissioner John King.
President Trump got sent to Washington, D.C. to solve some very big problems. He needs help. And I'm asking for your support to go help President Trump and solve these incredibly big problems. Thank you. General de División retirado.
King was born in Mexico, speaks Spanish. He's the former police chief of Doraville, which is in the suburbs of Atlanta. He's a former Atlanta police officer. He retired as a major general in the Army National Guard. He was first appointed to office by Governor Kemp and then elected in 2022. He's the first Hispanic official elected statewide in Georgia.
Rahul, one thing I noticed from the ads for both of these early launchers, bending over backward to hitch themselves to President Trump, which of course you kind of have to do to win a Republican primary in Georgia. Buddy Carter called himself a MAGA warrior. King said he wants to go to D.C. to support President Trump. Candidates are, I think, going to spend the next year trying to out-Trump each other, but then that could be a liability come general election season.
You know, a great example of this is Carter taking a leading role this week in shaping the president's and Republicans' priority of extending 2017 tax cuts, along with spending more on priorities like immigration enforcement. Carter is on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is looking to make $880 billion in cuts over the next decade, much of that through Medicaid, which the committee oversees. I watched part of a, get this, 26-hour hearing this week, which included Carter pushing back on Democrats, saying millions would lose Medicaid coverage.
We're making sure that no illegals are going to be on this program. We're making sure that people aren't registered in more than one state. We're making sure that there are going to be work requirements so that able-bodied adults are truly in need of it. That's what we're doing. We're stabilizing this program. To insinuate, to fearmonger that we are trying to kick people off is simply untrue.
The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office preliminarily estimated that 8.6 million people would eventually lose health insurance coverage with the proposed changes. And that's where what's happening in Washington could have significant implications for the 2026 state budget, which Governor Kemp signed just last week. If congressional Republicans make changes to programs like Medicaid, that could result in Georgia having to backfill funding. And look, some other states are already having difficult budget discussions. Georgia may be in a better position because of the billions of surplus dollars in reserve and much more limited Medicaid expansion that the state of Georgia has pursued.
You know, even some Republicans, including at some points Trump, have expressed discomfort with touching Medicaid. Now, one GOP proposal is adding work requirements in some cases, like Georgia does for some of those insured under Medicaid. Now, Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock is out with a report this week citing Georgia's experience with work requirements. Reports have found that the state spent a lot on administering the program compared to what it actually saved. And, you know, I think all of this kind of underscores that it is easier to announce these top-level targets for cuts, but it gets harder to make them when you get into the finer details, especially when you're looking at popular programs that affect people in Republican districts.
So I want to turn us back now to Atlanta and the state capitol.
Yeah, this week kind of feels like the official end of the legislative season.
I agree with you, Sam, because Wednesday was the last day Governor Kemp could sign or veto any legislation. It really does kind of wrap up the session.
Did anything significant get the veto pen?
Sam, I didn't see the governor veto any major pieces of legislation, but beyond those 7 vetoes, the governor did have an interesting signing statement on Senate Bill 255, which deals with subpoena powers for legislative committees at the state capitol, something we've seen with that state Senate committee that's investigating Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis.
And so just to clarify there, a signing statement means he did sign the bill, but he had some caveats or concurrences that he wanted to make clear in doing so.
You know, Sam, let me read part of what the governor put in that statement. Quote, I caution the General Assembly, however, that the procedure set forth in Senate Bill 255 should be used judiciously and sparingly. Americans of all political leanings have lamented the ineffectiveness of the United States Congress in no small part due to the abundance of politically motivated, and he put this in quotes, investigations, which only generate sound bites and distract from important legislation. I sincerely hope that in the future, Georgians do not similarly lament the General Assembly.
I thought this language was pretty striking from Governor Kemp. I've covered a lot of these committee hearings so far. Senate Republicans are now planning to expand that committee's purview to investigate a second subject, Democrat Stacey Abrams. Kemp also mentioned Congress there, nodding at the House Oversight Committee that, pursued impeachment against Biden officials, for example, but never really turned anything up.
I also wanted to mention some other bills that Kemp did sign on his final day, including one that we've covered extensively, Senate Bill 244. The original bill allowed defendants to get legal fees reimbursed if a district attorney is disqualified. The bill's sponsor, then Republican State Senator Brandon Beach, eventually made clear that he had President Donald Trump and his Fulton County election interference case co-defendants in mind after the disqualification of DA Fani Willis. Much to the frustration of Democrats and even some Republicans, Sam, that bill was combined with a bipartisan one that we've been covering, and that creates a new process to compensate Georgians who've been wrongfully convicted and jailed. Democratic State Representative Scott Holcomb has been working on this issue for years.
I look forward to the first cases being filed and moved through the system. These individuals deserve compensation. We cannot ever truly repay them for the decades that they lost.
That process would eventually lead to compensation of $75,000 for each year in prison. Sam, we're going to keep following what happens next with some of the people that we've profiled who are looking for compensation for years in prison.
I also want to note some other criminal justice bills that Kemp signed into law in recent days.
Yeah, let me mention two of them here. First, the Georgia Survivor Justice Act. That allows judges to reduce sentences for abuse survivors who can show that their crimes were connected to domestic violence. There's also House Bill 123 that was signed into law. That eases the burden of proof for defendants claiming an intellectual disability, and that is defined as having an IQ below 70 in death penalty cases. Supporters say there are 10 of the state's 90 death penalty cases that involve defendants that lawyers say have an intellectual disability.
Now, this is interesting because overall we've seen Kemp and Republicans of this era somewhat break from the model Governor Nathan Deal had been moving toward, a focus on criminal justice reform over harsh law and order. Georgia has one of the highest per capita incarcerated populations in the country, and advocates have lauded these two bills as important steps toward reform.
So let's leave it there. That's it for this edition of Plugged In from WABE.
Plugged In is produced by Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
Plugged In is available wherever you want to listen. Hey, if you listen on demand, make sure you head over to the Plugged In feed to subscribe and leave us a rating.
You can also now find us on the radio at 90.1 every Friday morning from 9:30 to 10 a.m.
And remember, public media is facing uncertain times around our funding. You can support this work with a gift to WABE at wabe.org/donate.
We'll be back next week.